I love my cemetery. It's a place of repose, it's a place of community. Scott's cutting the lawn. It's a place to reflect. Reverend Teller's 20 feet away, and he was born in 1774, died in 1864, not 19, I hope not. And I often reflect what it must have been like to have not seen the end of the Civil War. Truly, cemeteries become archives of memory for families and for all of us Americans as places to find history. But for the purpose of this presentation, I want to challenge some perhaps more recent trends in our cultural consciousness of cemeteries. First of all, as beautiful as these monoliths are, the average price for even a small, moderate monolith is $2,000 to $3,000. When added to the cost of a funeral of $10,000, we have to ask some fundamental questions. Is it worth that much? And would that really be the legacy we want to leave? The second question. We often think of stones as time immemorial. We sort of attach or equivocate between the two. Can natural burial, as an option where a gravestone or grave marker biodegrades in 70 years, help us rethink and reconfigure the way we imagine time? Time perhaps is more cyclical as our bodies biodegrade to feed other new life, rather than linear, rather than an ironic twist on Aristotle's idea of telos, or final purpose and final cause for which we live for or we mark our having lived for. And memoriam. I want the focus of this presentation to key in on the shifting stasis that natural burial gives us. The shifting stasis of not so much who gets memorialized as what gets memorialized.
First, definitions. The word graveyard is etymologically connected to the word guard, from which we get the word garden. The word cemetery comes from the Latin word cemeterium, in turn derivative from two Greek words, one used for bedroom, connoting rest and sleep, and the other word atrium, which means a place open to the sky. Immediately we are struck with wonderful inherent ambiguity, the ambiguity of a walled room and yet open space in the landscape. As art historian Kenneth Warpole notes, shelter and exposure, absence and presence, at one and the same time. Into this wondrous deathscape, enter what is alternatively called green burial, eco burial, or natural burial. Green burial is an extension lexically of the contested, closed yet open space of cemeterium. Mark Harris, eminent environmental columnist for the LA Times, defines natural burial as a return of the body to the natural environment as directly as possible, usually within rustic, often wooded settings. Vaults and metal coffins and embalmed remains are prohibited. Only simple grave markers are permitted, typically field stones or vegetation native to the area. Advocates cite simplicity, low cost, and return to the elements. Ponder this in stark contrast to the cost of an average American funeral provided by the American funeral industry, $10,000. Now, wondrous is my word du jour, and this is certainly a wondrous hotbed of rhetoric. Cemeteries represent a tension between the supposed traditional and commodified funeral. Traditional really only in terms of embalmment since 1910. A tension between cultural memory and an emerging ecological consciousness. A grand and wondrous debate as memories attain meaning and compel others to accept them and in turn are contested and subverted. Rhetoric at its best, definition courtesy of Kendall Phillips. This modern renewal movement in England since the 1990s and America since 1998 that embraces natural burial parks counters a dominant, perhaps reified, cultural norm of massive stone human memorials designed to defy decay. Advocates of natural burial claim that the decay of bodies in an ecosystem promotes new life. Death as the portal to new life. death inscribing cyclical rather than linear notions of memory and time. In contrast to Western memorial parks that can stultify ecological consciousness, green burial parks celebrate cyclical and seasonal life and acknowledge the impermanence of human memorial. Now, it would be remiss for me not to mention the 800-pound gorilla, and that is the natural burial movement, of course, correlates to larger cultural forces that influence how we represent and talk about death in the U.S., namely consumerism and economics. We must consider limited space, cost of funerals, and internment, the preservation of private versus public memory, landscape design, or lack of it, in American rural and city memorial parks, and an emerging consciousness of simplicity in cremation and ecologically sensitive approaches to internment and human memory, whereby the burial place becomes a much visited nature center. The problem here is what makes the ultimate grove of public memory, what best represents our identity, our regionalism, our communal and even national identity, our ethical responsibility as a species. I believe we need to shift beyond the traditional binaries of hegemonic versus alternative heteromania, official versus vernacular culture, high versus low in cultural geography terms. Many writers have argued that in other contexts, such as in new media, hegemonic official memory vies with private or vernacular public memory. Green burial modifies this contest by claiming an alternative that is not quite vernacular because it contests that memory must be subordinate to the ethos of nature. The material reality of Earth framing private representation must be considered. The memory not of an epitaph or spire defying gravity spiking the sky, but more of a winding creek, a place, space that deceased loved one would have loved to have visited, a place for all living beings, animals, flora, children, and adults. Memory here of self is subsumed by context, people less the product of capital. In socially designing a landscape, we produce culture as a means to categorize people into hierarchies, ordering people by gender, race, beliefs, activities, and ways of life, perhaps more often than we would like to admit. As social psychologist Ernest Becker wrote in his Pulitzer Prize-winning book, The Denial of Death, the world is terrifying and our basic human motivation is to deny our terror of death. Death is so overwhelming we try to suppress it and develop a hero system. Spurring and suppressing evil, we paradoxically then bring more evil into the world. We create hierarchies. Perhaps the cemetery for too long has been hierarchical as well. A denial, ultimately defining man apart from nature. Green burial offers an alternative. German geopolitical theorist Friedrich Ratzer coined the word Lebensraum, translated living space, the concept that the state could be a link between the people and the place, between the organic earth and the people born of it. Eminent geographer Wai-Fu Tuan termed the relationship between burial, landscape, and belief systems geopiety, a rather more pastoral version of the Durkheimian notion that space itself is socially and religiously constructed. Between the realpolitik of Ratzer's more Marxist vision and Tuan's pastoral vision lies the material and representational reality of green burial. Lies the seed of a new green rhetoric, a reinscribing of time in relationship to memorial and humans in relationship to earth.